my Metaverse friends, and welcome to another exciting episode of Metaverse Express Full Stop. I'm your host, Mona, and as always, we're here to bring you the hottest topics in the Metaverse with expert insights from our special guests. And speaking of our special guests, I am so excited. My friend Annie is on the show today.
Yeah. Glad to be back. This is a repeat for me, Mona.
Yes, this is because I like you. I love you, Annie.
Thank you.
Because I do love you. If you guys don't know, Annie is my co-host on Gaming on the Block. That's another show we host together. But he is more than just my co-host, though. I call him my Master Yoda for complex Web3 topics. How about that?
No, I appreciate it. Those are big shoes. Well, they're little shoes in size, but big shoes in stature to live up to. So I appreciate it.
It's true. Your knowledge and your insight is very valuable. But I'm going to let you talk about yourself and your background. I just want to say I'm so glad to have you on, and we're going to talk about some exciting topics today. So let me give you the opportunity first and foremost to give the viewers, I don't know if they remember you on my show, but give the viewers your background and what you've been up to in Web3.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. And I think the last time that we met, I was in a very different capacity. We were talking about DAOs, and I was really still kind of a freelancer at the time. Since then, I've had some pretty big changes. So I have moved from being in a few councils to now being the lead of the ETH Lizards organization. So we have really started to scale up the project. And I'll talk a little bit more over time in this episode about what ETH Lizards is doing. But fundamentally, we're a Web3 gaming organization that's focused on both supporting and building in terms of investments into early stage projects, as well as now building our own products and services for the top Web3 games in the sector. And it's a very exciting time to be a part of an organization growing like this. There aren't very many, frankly, in Web3 right now that are seeing major traction and movement. And so being a part of that in what's really a tough market is really great. But overall, I just can't wait to talk through some of these topics. I think your audience is really going to have fun learning a little bit more about Web3.
Yes, they are. We're going to run it back today, guys. We're going to take it all the way back to the basics because it's needed. And the reason it's needed is because, Annie, people to this day, I kid you not, ask me, I'm sorry to ask this stupid question, but what is Web3? And rightfully so, because I don't know if we've really taken the time to explain to people what Web3 really is. So I thought maybe tonight we run it back, we introduce Web3, we can talk about maybe its distinctive features because it has a lot of them. We can do a little comparison between Web3, Web 1, and Web 2. And then I always love to tell my audience, what problems is this thing solving? I think that's really what they care about. Well, how is this going to make my life easier? Why should I pay attention? And then frictions, because there are many of them. We have to talk about frictions, right? And then I also might want to bring AI into this. So that's a buzzword right now. And we do need to talk about how AI is going to fit in Web3. So a lot to talk about. How do you feel about all this? Do we have time? We're going to find out.
It's very ambitious, but let's do it, Laura. I think if we can't fit it into to an hour here, we probably shouldn't be doing the cast. So let's run through it and give your audience a good overview of the sector.
Yeah, for sure. And we're not going to go so in depth because honestly, as you know, and I'm sure as audience know, every one of these features, we could have a whole show about it, right? We're going to give you brief overview of what is Web3 and then features and some of the stuff that we talked about. So, and then if you guys still have questions, we can definitely dive a little deeper, like Annie was saying later on. So let's get this started. How about this? I'll go first with my definition of Web3, and then you go second.
That's great.
Okay. I'm going to give my definition of Web3 based on what I heard Chris Dixon, who is the founder of A16Z, and they call him the founder of 5 mental models of Web3. He described it at Permissionless event. I was there about, I think last year. Amazing mentor model. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Annie, was he one of the founders of Netscape Navigator. Am I right?
Yeah, he was the lead there, and really transitioned into to venture capital after the internet, the .com, both boom bust, and then the reemergence of the internet some 20 years ago. So certainly a big player in the tech space for several decades, and now with A16Z, definitely an individual worth listening to. So I think his framework is very well put. So keen to hear your description of it.
Yeah, and I kid you not, this stuck with me forever. To this day, I say it as much as I can, as long as I can, anywhere I can, because he described it so well. He said, if Web 1 was read, because all we could do at that time was just read the information, right? And Web 2 was read, write, because that was the introduction of MySpace and social media, right? Web 3 is read, write, own, right? Which really refers to the ownership aspect of content by users, which pretty much gives the power back to the content creators and then creates these economies. So that was kind of that. Did I do that right? Because that was kind of my understanding of it. Let me hear yours.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good framework. And when we talk about ownership, we want to make sure that people understand this is ownership of virtual assets, right? So when we say that, if you think about physical property that you own, your house or your car, or it could be as simple as a pen that you would say, I own this. We understand that concept innately, because we can see the thing, we can hold the thing, and very clearly, I have access to the thing that I own and someone else does not. When it's a virtual object, it's a lot more difficult, right? It feels very nebulous, very abstract. And so when we think about ownership in a virtual space like the internet, what does that even mean, right? What does it mean to say that I own something? I know I can't reach out and grab it, but what do I have the rights to do with that virtual property that exists? And that's what Web3 is trying to solve, is that ownership question. From a tech standpoint, Web3 is really comprised of a couple key elements, but they're all centered around the decentralization and, in many cases, open development of blockchain technologies. And so if you think about a single computer, or maybe a network of computers that exists in a typical corporation today, let's call Facebook or Amazon or Google or somebody like that, that company is going to own access to all of the tech, all of the devices in their organization. So it's a centralized structure. That company then is going to put on a product that you have access to based on whether they decide to grant you access. So they're going to have paywalls in place. They're going to have potentially user validations in place. And there's certainly advantages to centralization, but there are also risks. And I think anyone that has seen the proliferation of fake news, the proliferation of individuals that are being locked out of certain transaction capabilities today, we understand that it doesn't come without a price. And decentralization obviously is the opposite of that centralized approach. This is what Web3 is built on from a principle and an ethos standpoint. So to a large degree, Web3 actually comes back to the very first days of the internet, which we would call Web 1, where it was much more open. And it was only during the Web 2 days after the turn of the century, we got to the mid 2000s and the 2010s, that you saw these gigantic tech organizations begin to coalesce and really build these walled gardens around their property. We're so used to it now, but it didn't used to be that way. And so Web3 is trying to get back to that more basic premise of an open internet, an open tech environment for people to build on and own their own stuff in a virtual sense.
Wow, that's a big undertaking. That's a
Yes.
huge undertaking. And that really changes the game in so many different aspects. Like, I'm thinking even like advertising, the way we do everything is going to change. And I think, and we're going to talk about frictions, because it's only inevitable that there are frictions, you know, and it's funny because talking about Chris Dixon, and I think I'm going to refer to him a lot because I listened to his whole speech about this. He even said, he said, in all my years of building the internet, it takes about a decade, right? And in that decade, people come to me and say, what you're building is a fad, is not going to work. 10 years go by and the switch flips and people come to me and say, oh my God, this thing you build, it's revolutionizing even how we pick our president through social media now, right? So it really is a game changer, but it's still so early. We just started this, and this Web3 that we're talking about, it has so many elements that Web 1 and Web 2 didn't have. When we talk about Web 3, we're exploring blockchain. We're talking about blockchain. That's a whole show we can have. That's a whole thing that you have to build out. We're talking about tokens and this concept of tokenomics. We're talking about communities. We're talking about NFTs, culture, media, gaming. I mean, there is countless features and different aspects that we really can dive into, but also that Web 1 and Web 2 didn't really offer, right? Talk to us about these key features for Web 3, and then what is it that they're offering that we should really pay attention to now?
Yeah, so I'm going to divide this up a little bit into core sort of tech elements, and then some of these philosophical and ethical and ethos elements that exist in Web3. So from a tech standpoint, we all have to start with blockchains, right? The concept of these decentralized structures, and the best way to kind of view a blockchain for a layman is probably almost view this as a computer network that is open source. So meaning you can see what's going on in the back end. So blockchains allow you to write code that is immutable, meaning that it can't be changed. And that code is going to run in a way that everyone can view it. And it's going to run in a very decentralized way. And when I say decentralized, it can run on my computer, it can run on yours at the same time. And you see this broad network of devices that can run this software. So it takes what would typically be in a server farm in some computer data center somewhere for an existing Web2 organization, and it puts it into your home and my home and anywhere across the world that wants to run this tech. So the blockchain itself is sort of the foundational element of Web3. And on top of that, with use cases that we've seen in blockchains, you can have tokens. So the most famous of these is Bitcoin. Certainly you've got Ether, the Ethereum network, and there are many others that have been launched since then. Tokens are essentially a virtual asset, a virtual coin, a virtual holding of somebody, of an element of an individual network. So you can think of it like a dollar or a euro or a yuan. But at the end of the day, a token allows you to say, I own a part of a fractional share in this particular project or in this particular chain. We've got NFTs that are kind of their own game, and maybe we'll talk about those in a minute. But this allows virtual objects to be more structured than just a simple token. So a token you could think of more or less as a single item like a dollar bill that has some simple logic built into it. An NFT or a non-fungible token is an item that has a much more advanced computer program that you can basically run. So that can take the shape of images in artwork. It can take the shape of music. It can take the shape of information. All of those would fall into an NFT that allows you to have a much more advanced content of a virtual asset that someone could own. And then the last element that I want to highlight is the DAO. And this is a structure that's built.
I forgot about that. Yeah. I didn't
exactly.
even mention DAOs. Oh my gosh, there's so much. Yeah, go ahead.
There is. Yeah. So a DAO is basically a structure built around a community that's using either tokens or NFTs to try and solve a specific problem or to build with a certain end goal in mind. And so these are really the kind of the core building blocks of the Web3 space from a tech standpoint and a structural standpoint that most projects are going to be focused on today.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, between NFTs, and we didn't even talk about community, by the way, because that's something that really differentiates, in my opinion, what really sets Web3 apart, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we didn't have in Web2 and Web1 and Web2 is communities, right? It is crazy how passionate people are in Web3 to come here and teach each other how this thing works. You know, the first thing we always ask each other when we meet each other in person, we're like, what's your Web3 story? How'd you get here? And everyone's like, well, I left my Web2 job, I left my traditional job, and I came to Web3. And so everybody has taken a leap in faith and left their jobs to come and do it here on their own. But there's such a communal support for it. It's incredible, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. When we consider what are the core, that's the core ethos or the core philosophy of Web3, community is probably the most visible place where it's going to start. But we talk about that in transparency. We think about self-ownership and self-custody of your own assets, that responsibility pillar. And we think about decentralization, right? The idea that, we want to have more freedom from an internet standpoint than we have today. And I think those are the sort of core philosophical approaches that Web3 companies are going to show. And again, it's not perfect, but frankly, when you look at types of the different sectors, let's say, that are building meaningful, game-changing tech and that are building in a way that has the potential to revolutionize the world at the same level of the internet, there's a very small list. And at the top of that is certainly Web3.
Yeah, definitely. And access is another one too. The access in Web3 is very different in Web2 and Web1. There is so much that we can honestly talk about here. If you guys want to learn more about Web3, I highly, highly recommend reading Chris Dixon's 5 Mental Models of Web3. He just dives deep in some of these features and really explains how it works and applies. And he dives into the importance of Web3. And this is the next topic I want to ask you, Annie, the importance of Web3. I actually have it here. I wrote it down because I love what he says. He says Web3 is an internet that is owned by builders and users, orchestrated with tokens. Do you believe that? Alluding to fungible and non-fungible tokens. And he just goes on and talks about advertising, how it's going to affect advertising. If you're tired of target marketing, this is the other option. And he goes on. But let me bring it back to you. Where do you see the importance of Web3? What problem do you see it solving that's really important we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, so the problem is one that's really insidious, and I'm going to challenge our audience to think about this today. If I told you that I was going to start a new company and that company was going to manufacture an object that I sold you, let's say I was going to manufacture a car, and I'm going to sell you that car. But after I sell you that vehicle, the one caveat is I still own it. You say, okay, well, wait a minute. I thought you were selling it to me. That sounds more like a rental or like a lease structure.
Doesn't bank say that, Annie? Are you saying you're the bank?
Absolutely. But in this case, like I'm telling you, you got to pay me the full value of the vehicle. But I'm going to retain the rights at any point to take that car back from you. You're going to look at me like I'm crazy and say, I have no interest. Like I can get a much better deal from someone else who, if I pay for this vehicle, it's mine. And you don't retain any rights to it as the manufacturer. In the virtual space today, that's the complete opposite of what we have, though, because if you think about it, when you go into any sort of virtual world, whether it's the internet around Facebook and you're going into your own account, you're putting up YouTube videos as a content creator. You're a gamer who's in there playing in CS:GO or Fortnite. You're a musician who's creating, or you're even a consumer who's buying music through a streaming service. In all of these cases, you're paying the money for these virtual objects, but you have no ownership of them afterwards. The creators, the manufacturers in this case, the distributors, they retain basically 100% of the rights of ownership of any of these virtual goods. We're so used to that because this is the way that the world is, and it has been, again, for the better part of a decade, that we don't even really question that anymore, right? This is one of those kind of matrix moments when, as you think about it, you say, oh, now I understand the whole red pill, blue pill thing. Like, do I really want to wake up and think about what that means to me as a consumer? You can say, no, I'll just leave it. It's fine. Crypto's a scam. Web3 is stupid. I don't want to. But as soon as you start to really consider that prospect that, hey, I am paying all of this money for all these things and I own none of them at the end of the day, you start to wonder, why is that the case? There's a lot of reasons that exist, but basically we did a terrible job as a society when the internet became popular at defining property rights and defining virtual structures. That coalesced into the system and the framework that we have today, where, again, these large tech organizations own all of the assets that exist. And you as a consumer don't, even though in the real world, again, using that car example, you would be livid if an organization said, I can repossess your vehicle just because I made it in the first place. Like, no, I paid for it. This is mine. Web3 tries to solve that. So why does it matter? It gets us to a point where in the virtual world, which frankly, most of us spend a majority of our days in a lot of the world in a virtual space, whether it's in our professional careers, whether it's in our hobbies, whether it's with our friends and our family, more of our time than ever is being spent in a virtual setting where we don't own anything. And so if you could set up a structure that was, let's say, decentralized, then anyone could own their own objects. They had responsibility. They had self-ownership and self-custody of their own items. And by the way, they could send those items to somebody else if they wanted. They could buy the items, but they retain the rights to them. That would be kind of an improvement, wouldn't you say? And so as we think about what Web3 is bringing, this is the core foundation that the underlying tech promises, and we have to build it out because we're still in the very early days of development for solutions, for use cases. But we see a lot of these beginning to emerge. And I firmly believe that over the next decade, we're going to look back on the early 2020s and say, okay, this was the same time period as the late 1990s before we saw the actual tech boom that led to the internet that we know today. My approach is that we should be building this in a way philosophically and with the ethos that we want, that we lost in the internet over the past couple of decades. So we missed our chance there. This is a second bite at the apple to try and fix that.
And that's huge. I mean, you really are giving power back to creators. I do want you to go one step further, maybe, and give us a good example of economies that it has a potential of creating. We have in-game economies that, Axie Infinity back during COVID, a lot of people in the Philippines were supporting themselves. So these in-game economies became very popular, but then there was a backlash in the Web3 space because they didn't want Web3 to be about that or the game to be about that. But then there's this other side of the economy that it's bringing for, let's say, music artists, right? Because for so many decades, music artists have had to deal with labels, and labels are that big corporation that you're talking about that take your hard work and give you a little percentage of it. So give us a good example of the economy that Web3 brings to the table, maybe for the artists. That's a good example I can think of, right?
Yeah, artists or developers, both, I think is a great example here, where they're generally not going to have any sort of residual value from the products that they create. And again, it's pretty simple when you think about it. If as an artist, I can only sell you the rights to this object one time, there's no secondary market that exists for an object because that virtual object is sold once and then it ends. Well, that's fine. But by the same token, if you think about a real world item, if I buy a car from you and then I go and sell it to my neighbor afterwards, that secondary value, that item still has, that same value to the second person that it did for me when they're buying it, right? Maybe the value is a little bit lower, it's depreciated, maybe it's appreciated. We don't know the directionality, but if it still has value to somebody else, why shouldn't they have the ability to buy it back from me? The basic problem there is IP. because it's easy in a tech space to just copy something, right? These are all ones and zeros. You can create those same ones and zeros in the same order and get the same object a billion times if you wanted to. And so you have a problem that exists in the virtual world that doesn't in the physical, where you don't have a cost of goods production in general, right? The cost of server space is pretty negligible now. So what Web3 does is it creates technical solutions for validating ownership. It says, okay, not only do I own this thing, we can also see that maybe Mona created this thing on the front end. She sold it to me. And you can establish some very interesting economies, like you mentioned, for residual sales. So if you sell it to me and say, "Hey, Annie, I'm gonna sell you this particular song. You pay me $5 for it. You can listen to it as much as you want. It's yours. You do with it what you want." If you then sell it to somebody else, this particular track of a song, you sell it for whatever you want, but I'm going to take 2% of the sales fee on top, or 5%. And I don't mind if you actually resell it then. That person doesn't have to buy it from me. They can buy it from you once you're done with it. You then give up the rights to own that thing, but someone else can take it for maybe a lower price. But now all of a sudden I have this virtuous cycle where I can get additional royalties on the back end as a creator. And so with
but
a
also
smart,
me as a fan,
you
right?
as a fan, 100%. Yeah, you can be invested, and you can have a shared ownership. So maybe you say, look, Annie, I would like you to create a song for me, and I'm going to fund it, but I'm also going to retain 2% of all the sales of that song in perpetuity. And I say, okay, that sounds great to me. I need to pay my bills over the next month and a half while I go write this hit song. So we get these really, really interesting models that can't exist when you can't establish virtual asset ownership. But now with blockchain technology, not only can you establish it, you can do so in a way that is 100% guaranteed. It's fully transparent. And it's verifiable on the back end. And so all of a sudden, models for sales and for revenue structures that didn't exist before all of a sudden make sense, and they're actually pretty easy to spin up, and you can replicate them because you can see all of that code in another project. Because again, in general, these are open source protocols that you can see all of the tech. And as a result, it allows you not just to create these concepts, but to replicate them over and over again in very simple ways with a Solidity developer or with someone that knows blockchain tech.
There is so much happening because, I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking transparency is huge here, because now we're seeing where the money is going, where the content is going, right? There's added value, not just for the artist, but for the fan. So I make money listening to your content. You make money by me listening to your content. It's a two-way street now, which brings me to the question of then how does that change the position of, let's say, the label, or how about YouTube for that matter? How are they going to transition in a situation like this when things are becoming so decentralized in this model?
Yeah, so like any major technology, there's going to be a lot of disruption. And what that means is often the incumbent organizations, this is true with any technological shift and revolution. This is like the Blockbuster and Netflix example that I'm sure all of our audience has heard about and has seen, where if you're an incumbent in an industry that's being completely disrupted by a new technology, you have basically three choices, right? You can embrace it and you can say, we're going to change our business model, understanding what is our core value that we're providing to our customers, but we're going to do it in a different way by leveraging the new technology. You can say, we're going to continue our existing strategy. We don't think the new technology is the right way to go, or potentially, in most cases, it threatens our existing business structure so much that we can't figure out a way to transition from how we're approaching the market today to a way that uses this new tech. Or three, we can just stop playing entirely because we think this isn't going to be a sustainable solution, and we can pivot our business to an entirely different structure, right? So those are the general approaches that these organizations—
You can't beat them, join them. That's what I say.
Exactly. And so, most in history, most large incumbents tend to take the second route. And there's a lot of reasons behind it, but fundamentally, their structures and all the people in their organization, their shareholders, they're very risk averse. And so they're much more afraid of losing the existing revenue structures that they've built over time, and are going to be very slow to react and adapt to the new technology. And this is why you see very quickly new entrants into a sector. Again, this is the Netflix example, that they will establish an entirely different business model that better meets the needs of consumers using that new tech, and completely oust the incumbent. And so that incumbent, it may be only a couple of years, and all of a sudden their margins start to decrease. And 10 years later, they're completely out of business from being, a top 50 company in the world. This is a pattern that's been repeated over and over again. It's not going to be unique to Web3. It wasn't unique to the internet. But at the end of the day, these organizations are going to have to make a choice as far as how they're going to approach this disruptive tech. And I think the key message that's good for us as consumers is, at the end of the day, as long as there's not major efforts to hamper the adoption of new tech by governments around the world, and by regulators, you're going to see the best tech win. And so I'm a firm believer that as long as you have appropriate regulation in place, let the market figure out what makes sense and let consumers choose. Would you rather go with Facebook and say, okay, I'm giving you all of my data, you're not paying me for it, you're basically monetizing off of my information? Or an approach like maybe Lens Protocol has, where they say, good, you can have access to all and own all of your own information. You can actually have an audience that you're capturing across different content creation channels that you can take across all these different mediums, totally up to you. As a consumer, if I have more choices, I'm going to gravitate towards whichever one better meets my needs. And I believe that people should have the right to make that decision. Let the technology decide who's going to win based on the use cases that these organizations can build out.
Gala is testing the watch to earn model, right? Where you can watch something and earn the way with the model that you described with the artists and the fans. The same thing if you're watching a film. We're seeing more and more NFTs being that feature that we talked about, being used in some of the use cases that we have to do in our daily lives, right? Like we're seeing NFTs being used in ticketing right now, or being at least tested in ticketing, listen to earn model, watch to earn model. I'm even seeing teach to earn models. So it's just very interesting to see which one of these features are more adaptable and we can actually use them in our daily lives. And I think we're still ways away from that. And this brings me to our roadblocks, because we have many of them, and rightfully so. We're introducing not just one tech. I mean, you're introducing so many different technologies here, right? Like with blockchain, we got security vulnerabilities, rightfully so. We didn't even talk about interoperabilities, but we have interoperability challenges, right? In DeFi, as a whole technology where we're introducing self-custody, we have crypto regulation issues, right? We just said NFTs, NFT ownership rights that you were talking about earlier. That's something we still are trying to figure out, even down to the language of Web3 that is not so accepted by the mainstream. And we're still trying to figure out, what should we call the NFTs, because people don't like NFTs? What should we call crypto? Because they definitely don't like to say crypto. So, I mean, obviously you mentioned earlier, we're still early. Is it because we're still early? Can we see the light at the end of the tunnel here? And how long do you think this is going to take? Like Chris Dixon says, decade. We're 5 years in. Another 5 years?
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. If you look at the adoption curve of the internet and of cell phone technology and others, we appear to be on the same trend line for crypto and Web3 as those. And if you follow that model out to just kind of logical conclusion, yeah, I think Chris is about right. We're somewhere in the 5-year mark to seeing true mainstream adoption, meaning billions of people that are regularly using crypto tech in their daily lives, and they don't even think of it as odd anymore, right? So that's kind of the point at which you reach mainstream adoption, is when people don't talk about, this is a Web3 company, this is a Web3 product. It's just a product. It's just a company. But I think we're a few years out. I want to highlight, though, sort of the challenge when you're in the middle of a revolution like this in technology and what that can look like. And I want to use probably the most famous of the dot-com bust companies in the late 90s and early 2000s, which was pets.com. So anyone, you may remember this, Mona, for our
Yes.
audience. They had the cutest puppy was like the mascot for
Yes.
this. And they had the best advertisements. They raised almost $100 million as part of their IPO. And the organization, just a couple years later, went completely bankrupt. And the question was why, right? So their business model is actually going to sound pretty reasonable if you hear it today. So if I tell you there's an organization that's going to ship pet food and pet supplies to you at your home, you don't have to go to a store to buy it. And by the way, if you need some more pet food, you can just sign up and say, deliver it to me every couple of weeks and it'll be at your door. I look at that and say, yeah, of course, I use them. Like I have a company that does
And
that
so
for me
many
for
people
my
did.
dog.
So
Yeah.
many
And
people did.
in 2023, I look at that and say, oh, yeah, of course, this makes sense. The problem was in the late 90s, they didn't have an appropriate distribution channel to bring the cost of delivery of large size bags of pet food in a way that made sense economically. And so their business model from a tech standpoint actually made sense. What they were lacking was the infrastructure to make it a reality. And even at that time, Amazon was a big partner with pets.com. Most people don't remember this, but it actually had really negative impacts to Amazon's share valuation when pets.com went out of business. Amazon, as we know today, is the largest distributor in the world. And they, at the time, were also moving in that direction, but they hadn't been able to build out the tech around the internet that was necessary for pets.com to be viable. Today, I can go to chewy.com and do the same thing that pets.com's business model was, but it took us 20 years for this to really become mainstream and something that we all just naturally think of and we would do.
What a
So
great lesson you're walking
you can
into.
be
Yep.
right at the wrong time, and that's still indistinguishable from being completely wrong. And so, one of the key points when we talk about the roadblock is there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to exist for this technology to be able to go mainstream. Consumer protection, security, the ease of use and onboarding, all of these are areas where blockchain tech fails pretty dramatically right now, but it won't 5 years from now. And that's because a lot of these top organizations that are building out the infrastructure that's necessary, they're building out wallet solutions, they're building out security solutions, they're building better user experiences and user interfaces that allow for the average consumer to really be able to approach the tech in a way that feels seamless to them. That's necessary because you don't have any idea how your microwave works. You don't know what your refrigerator is actually doing. You
Nor do
use
I
your
care to know.
cell phone every day, right?
Right.
It doesn't matter. We just assume that all of these things work because the user interface has been built in such a way that I don't have to know. I just use the use case that it was designed for, and it works perfectly well for that. Web3
just want to
technology.
click. We want to click. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. And so when we talk about roadblocks and impediments and friction, those are some of the key elements that need to be built out still, and it's primarily around the user experience. The actual use cases for the technology, there are a lot that have been shown to be viable. You mentioned, and Eat Lizards and my organization are more focused on the gaming sector of Web3. There are plenty of companies that have shown how the technology can be leveraged in a way that's much better for gamers and for consumers because they can own their own in-game assets. The initial use cases, though, were not set up in such a way that it was sustainable. They didn't have the appropriate safeguards in place. The economics hadn't been set up in a way that was going to last. And the user experience was so poor that it was such a pain to be onboarded, such a pain for user retention that the typical gamer wants nothing to do with the initial round of Web3 games. But fast forward from 2019, 2020 to today, now all of a sudden we see different examples, Wildcard and Illuvium and Metalcore, these games that when they show the gameplay demos at major conferences, players come up and they can't tell that it's a Web3 game. But when you show them the gameplay and say, oh, this is just a fun game to play, and then they learn, oh, I can actually own my own stuff, that all of a sudden gets the wheels turning. And as long as you have a compelling product from a gaming standpoint, in this instance, to a gamer, they're going to listen to what other advantages the technology has to them on the back ends. The initial hesitation was around the user experience for the first games was so poor, no one was interested in the technology. But
And crypto, by the way.
in crypto, exactly.
Right.
Same thing. That the tech has to be abstracted away for people to understand what is the value to me as an individual user.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I wanted to also ask you, because we've always said, at least I too believe that gaming is going to be that lower barrier to entry. So do you see a hybrid happening here, or do you think it's going to be Web 2 and then Web 3?
Yeah, so I think it's always an interesting distinction here. And I know when I hear people talk about Web 2.5, it makes sense, right? They're talking about having a user experience that feels like Web 2, but with Web3 technology underneath it, right? Which is, which makes a lot of sense. And to say like, oh, you actually have ownership of your own assets, but you just don't realize it, I think is a very easy point of entry for your typical customer. I still to a large degree think of those as Web3 projects. I just think they're doing a better job at marketing. This is one of the big problems with Web3 companies is they tend to focus on the tech. And for any of your audience that hasn't heard Simon Sinek, he has in his most famous speech that really kind of set him off in the path as one of the most popular speakers in the world. It's called The Golden Circle. And he did this TED Talk where he spoke about knowing your why, right? So if you've ever heard in like a corporate setting, know what your why is and be able to articulate it.
Always bring that up, guys. You guys know I bring this up all the time.
It comes from Simon Sinek, in using that first TED Talk that sort of launched him into stardom.
Yeah.
As a Web3 community and sector, we're really good about talking about the what and
not
the
so much
how,
the why.
and
Yes.
not the why. And from a user standpoint, it's really easy to say, I don't care about the tech, and you're boring me and you're scaring me because this sounds like I need to be now a computer scientist to understand all of this.
Yes.
And to just recoil and run away and say it's not worth it to me. Because we're not doing a very good job of explaining from a marketing standpoint what is better for you as a consumer and why should you have interest in this technology, right? That's what it comes down to. And so that's why I like talking about not just the tech, like for an audience like yours, it's important to say these are the building blocks, but also why, right? We talk about transparency and community and ownership and responsibility and all of these elements. That's what people are going to understand. And then they're going to have an interest in the use cases and the technology. And so I don't really know that I buy into this as a Web 2.5 solution. I think you'll have Web 2 primary companies that just will either acquire or merge with other organizations that will adopt the technology. They're still using Web 3 tech. They may or may not decide to apply Web3 ethos and philosophy to how they're approaching it. But at the end of the day, I think having that better use and that better support for customers and for consumers is a good use case, right? And that's all on its own just better than Web 2. So whatever we want to call it for me is fine, as long as we have people that are embracing the tech, because that means they're also more likely to understand and embrace the values in the long run.
And it's a huge shift. It is a huge shift no matter how you look at it. But as if things weren't complicated enough, Annie, as if we didn't have enough in Web3 to solve, here comes this really cool toy called AI, right? And of course, now there's a lot of hype around AI. What are your thoughts on this convergence of AI and Web3? Can these two be friends? Can this marriage work? How are you seeing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mona. I think they can. I tend to be more on the optimist side of AI. And frankly, if anyone's been following the news and different personalities, be they governmental or popular opinion leaders and thought leaders, there's a big debate that's going right now on, is the future of AI a positive one? Is it going to kill us all? Are we going to see massive improvements in quality of life for everyone on the planet? Is it somewhere in between? I tend to be a little bit more on the optimistic side of the ledger here. And I think, frankly, we've seen the same story play out with almost every major tech innovation over the last few thousand years. And we haven't seen any technology that has really made the overall value proposition to humanity worse. Now, we've seen use cases that I think we would argue have probably been for the negative, but by and large, humans are very adaptable and they're very creative at finding good solutions. And so I think this will be the case for AI as well. Now, there are certainly risks there because all of a sudden you don't have people that are as fully in control as they are of existing technology. But I think it's just the next level of that evolution. And so AI is I like to think of as a lever for any other process or capabilities. In the same way that, like an engine, the steam engine revolutionized the world in the first and second industrial revolutions, we're going to see AI do the same thing here with the knowledge economy. And so in previous times, if you wanted to go out and run a farm, you would go plant your seed. You might, use some animals to help you out, but for millennia of human existence, you are basically limited to a linear increase in your productivity based on the number of people that you put on a job. Mm-hmm. Now, in the late 1800s, you ended up having technology that allowed engines to exist. And so instead of just having a one-for-one increase with people, you could have a 50 times increase in the value of one human's productivity in the physical world.
Yes.
The same way with AI in a knowledge economy, where now as a software developer, I was always limited by the amount of code that I could write. So your audience may not know, I actually started my professional career in software development, and I could crank out a certain number of lines of code in a day, but I was pretty limited. The technology that existed back then was good for finding some bugs, but I couldn't scale it at any kind of exponential level. Now with AI, that's not true anymore. And so as a developer, I have the ability to have exponentially faster code development, code review. And it's the same in the creative industries with artwork, with lore writing, with storyline creation. And then you begin to combine all of that together and say, okay, now not only that, I could generate an entire feature-length movie from the scripts to the actors and actresses to the sets to the dialogue, and I can put all of that together with a very small team. That type of technology is going to dramatically disrupt many, many industries. And so Web3, I think, is not unique to this, but certainly it's very interesting to think about the intersection of these two major technological shifts happening at about the same time. And I still think we're a little bit early with really major use cases for general AI. I think we're probably at that stage that Web3 was 4 or 5 years ago. And so there's a lot of hype right now. I think we're going to go through this sort of valley of disillusionment for the next few years when people realize it's amazing, and it's also not completely ready yet for massive, easily accessible customer usability. But give it 10 years from now, and we're not going to recognize many of our industries of today because of the promise of the tech. And so now I would say if you're not using AI in your job and you're in any sort of knowledge work, you probably should reevaluate and start. So I use it on a daily basis in a number of ways myself.
Same, right here.
Our dev team, this is an expectation. If you're coming in and you're doing software, but you're not doing anything with AI, if you're doing artwork, you're doing lore writing, whatever that might be, it's too good of a tool to pass up, even at this early state. But it's going to be a little while before it really completely displaces a number of jobs, because you still have to have someone who knows how to leverage the tech.
Exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, AI is still early too. And, at first it came out and everybody was scared and, oh my God, it's going to take everybody's jobs. And, I heard my University of Central Florida professors had an official university faculty meeting about AI because they were so scared that students, that's it, that's the end of it. How are we going to do exams? How are we going to have them write their papers? Everybody's going to cheat on AI. We're going to cut AI out of our network. That's what they came up with initially. But I think as people started to understand that is not the enemy, but it's really here to do that heavy lifting and make us much, much more efficient. I read CoinDesk article that I sent to you earlier. They did an amazing job of explaining how AI can come together with blockchain and Web3. They even called the convergence chocolate meets peanut butter, which is really cute. And they were saying the same thing. You know, it's bringing productivity, it's bringing efficiency. Sure, maybe it's taking some jobs, but the level of productivity that it's bringing, the level of efficiency that it's bringing for us to do more our own work more efficient, it's untouchable. They don't need to be competitors. They really are. I think what they said was they're tools in the box, right? That they can complement each other and really help us to live a better life. But I think we're still ways away from that. They both present some dangers, or that's how people see it right now. It's not fully trusted yet. But I think in time, not only this will change, I can't imagine like NFTs and blockchain and AI. I mean, all of these concepts and features, elements coming together. What will our world look like?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's going to be mind blowing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when I talk to my kids, my oldest son is just turning 8 years old now, and I wonder about the world that he's going to grow up in about the time that he's graduating high school and going off to college and into the workforce. And again, talking about this 10-year sort of horizon for mass adoption of Web3 and probably a similar type of cycle, 10, maybe 15, maybe 20 years. But really we'll see AI being a major player in the space. I think we need to recognize that with this kind of change, as humans, we need to be very adaptable, because there is going to be a lot of disruption, right? And again, coming back to the example of AI being a force multiplier in the knowledge economy and in sort of the intellectual space, if your entire livelihood and your career was built around being a physical labor back in the 1800s, and someone said, "Oh, we now have a steam engine that you can use," that all of a sudden agriculture and manufacturing and mining, these industries no longer need you to do that role. You'd have looked at it as a travesty. And we did. We saw people that basically lost their minds that this is going to destroy my way of life. And in some cases, it disrupted it. But if you look at the overall arc of humanity, it was very much a positive. It was less than 50 years later that you saw really all of the negativity around the new technology had evaporated. And of course there were pushbacks at different places in the world in different times, but generally speaking, it only takes one generation before the new technology is just the way that the world is, and it's the way that you become accustomed to it, and that no longer has that fear for you as a consumer or as an employee or as a business leader. You have always grown up in a world that had that technology present, and so you've come to embrace it over time. And so that's where I think, for those of us that are further along in our careers, and that are raising kids especially, you need to begin thinking about how you're going to prepare for this world that's going to dramatically change over the next decade or so, and how you're going to prepare your kids for that. And there are ways that you can be approaching it by firstly learning what the technology is and what the use cases are, and then just being open to flexing, because there are going to be more jobs that are created that weren't possible today than there are going to be jobs that are lost because the technology replaces the need for them.
Annie and I do a third show Friday nights on family and relationship and how to keep your children
Right.
grounded in this next iteration of the internet.
Mm-hmm.
No, but it's really true. I'm having flashbacks of my grandma when I was little telling me what is email? Why do you need to email? Just write a letter, and she never
Mm-hmm.
understood what a pager was. And I feel like we're going to be our grandparents, Annie. That's what's happening.
It's not going to be very long. Give it another 10 years, we're not going to know what the world is like either, Mona.
No, we are the grandparents now. Can you believe it?
This is wild.
Well, Annie, this was so much fun. I can talk to you all day and time goes by so fast when we're chatting, but I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so, so much for coming on the show and talking to us about Web3. I know there's going to be many, many more to come. Where can people find you, reach out to you, Eats Lizard? Give us a little information so I can also put it in the show note for people as well.
Yeah, for sure. I would say find me in ETHLizard's Discord primarily. And you can also see me on Twitter. I have a YouTube channel, not as active at the moment, just because I'm spending all of my my free time and then some with ETHLizards continuing to build out in this brave new world that we've talked about today of Web3 gaming. So you can find the links in the description with Mona. And for me, the entire purpose of being here is to evangelize, but then also provide meaningful use cases for gamers, for consumers to understand what this technology offers and to come into the sector and realize this is a better way of doing things than we have today, right? So I always talk about Web3 gaming being the gateway drug to decentralization. And I think you come and stay for the use cases, and then you're going to adopt a lot of those values that are beneficial that we as humans are going to really see a need for a lot more in the future. So thank you so much for the opportunity to join, Mona. It's a pleasure as always.
Of course, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us tonight. All right, guys, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and I'll promise Annie will be back. But I'll be back next week with more hot topics in the metaverse. Until then, I'm your host, Meta Mona. Stay well.